Prince William had finally made his move, and inside Buckingham Palace, nothing would ever be the same. He had picked up a pen, drafted a formal document, and entered it permanently into the official palace records. With that single act, he had shut a door that Queen Camilla had spent nearly a decade quietly, relentlessly, and deliberately pushing open. The letter was calm, the language was measured, but the message it carried was so cold and so precise that sources close to the palace say Camilla has not fully recovered from it since. And the one question no one inside those walls could answer, the question that changed everything, was whether King Charles would choose his wife or his heir. Before we go any further, if you follow stories like this one closely, take a moment to subscribe now. Stories that begin inside palace corridors rarely end where they first appear to start. But to understand why William finally reached for that pen, we cannot begin with a guest list or a coordination meeting. We have to go back much further, to a private room, a grieving teenager, and a leak that Camilla believed would never be traced back to her. In April 2026, a document was quietly entered into the official palace records. It did not arrive with an announcement. There was no press release, no formal statement, no public acknowledgement of any kind. It simply appeared, signed, sealed, and permanently logged in the administrative systems that govern the most sacred ceremonial events in the British calendar. The document had been drafted on the authority of Prince William, Prince of Wales, and what it contained would detonate inside Buckingham Palace like nothing that had come before it. The Royal Maundy service was approaching. Each year, this ceremony stands apart from every other event in the royal calendar, not because of its spectacle, but because of what it demands of the person at its center. This is not a banquet. It is not a garden party or a diplomatic reception where guest lists flex according to comfort and preference. The Royal Maundy service traces its origins back over 800 years, to a king who knelt before the poor and placed alms directly into their hands. Every element of the ceremony, the recipients chosen for decades of quiet, selfless service to their communities, the coins placed personally by the sovereign, the complete absence of pomp in favor of genuine humility exists to communicate one thing: that the crown serves the people, not the reverse. This year, the service carried additional weight. It was being held at St. Asaph Cathedral in North Wales, only the second time in those 800 years that the ceremony had taken place on Welsh soil. The eyes of the nation were fixed on it. And somewhere inside the coordination process for that service, a name had appeared on a proposed guest list that William was not prepared to accept. That name was Laura Lopes. Laura Lopes holds no royal title. She carries out no official duties on behalf of the crown. She has no working mandate of any kind and no formal place within the structure of the British monarchy. By every institutional definition, she is a private citizen, the daughter of Queen Camilla from Camilla's first marriage, a woman with no more constitutional claim to a sacred royal ceremony than anyone watching from home. And yet her name had been placed on that list as though her attendance required no justification whatsoever. William's response was not a phone call. It was not a quiet word passed through intermediaries. It was a formal written document structured not merely as a guest list amendment, but as a policy revision governing attendance at royal ceremonial events going forward. The document stated clearly, without ambiguity or room for negotiation, that Laura Lopes would not be attending the Royal Maundy service. And it was entered permanently into the official palace records. Not a suggestion. Not a preference. A permanent institutional record. The moment Camilla's office discovered what had been filed, the atmosphere inside the palace shifted entirely. Those present described the reaction as immediate and severe, because Camilla understood something in that moment that went far beyond a single ceremony, far beyond one name removed from one guest list. She understood that William had not simply blocked her daughter from an event. He had put it in writing, and he had done it deliberately. The question was why, and the answer to that went back much further than anyone in that room was prepared to say aloud. When Camilla discovered that the exclusion order had already been logged into the sovereign's diary system, the people closest to her said the reaction was unlike anything they had witnessed before. Not simply anger, something closer to disbelief, the particular shock of someone who has spent years carefully constructing a world around herself, only to find that one of its walls has been quietly removed while she wasn't looking. To understand why the response cut so deep, you have to understand what Laura's presence inside the monarchy had come to represent. It had not happened overnight. It had happened gradually, methodically, one appearance at a time, each one slightly further inside the institution than the last, each one unchallenged, each one quietly normalizing what had never been formally granted. It began in June 2022 at the Order of the Garter Service, one of the most exclusive ceremonies in the British calendar, reserved strictly for knights and working royals. Laura was there. No title, no working role, no explanation offered. Then came September 2022, and the state funeral of Queen Elizabeth II, the most watched royal event in living memory, with the entire world's eyes fixed on every face in that room. Laura was placed among the family. Then, May 2023, the coronation at Westminster Abbey. Laura attended. But it was what happened next that crossed every line that had ever existed. Her sons, Gus and Louis, stood on the Buckingham Palace balcony as pages of honor, positioned at the very center of the most photographed moment of the entire ceremony. Camilla's grandchildren. Children carrying no royal blood and holding no formal place within the institution, presented to the world as part of the sovereign family. The pattern continued. Royal Ascot, in June 2025. The Sandringham Christmas gathering in December 2024, the most private and intimate royal occasion of the entire year, reserved for the innermost circle. Laura walked through that door too. Cheltenham Festival in March 2025, openly beside Camilla in front of cameras. Each appearance said the same thing without a single word being spoken. I belong here. And for years, the answer from the institution was silence. That silence had been Camilla's greatest asset. When she attempted to mobilize her internal palace network in the hours after discovering William's document, what she found stopped her cold. She had spent years quietly placing sympathetic staff in key logistical roles. She had woven her family into the social fabric of the monarchy until their presence felt expected and natural. That network was her armor, her guarantee that her family's place inside the institution could not be touched. But when she reached for it, it was no longer where she had left it. Many of those officials now deferred directly to the office of the Prince of Wales. The loyalty had not simply been bypassed, it had been replaced. And that was when something shifted beneath the fury. Because Camilla was not simply a mother reacting to her daughter being excluded from a ceremony. She was a woman who had built an empire inside an institution that did not formally belong to her, and she was watching it come apart. But none of that empire had been built in a day. And none of it had been built honestly. What William knew and what Camilla had never expected him to use had begun in a private room at Highgrove, the night he was 16 years old and still hollow from burying his mother. Less than a year after Diana's death, Charles made a decision that would define the relationship between his son and his wife for the next 3 decades. He arranged a private meeting between William and Camilla at Highgrove. William was 16 years old. He had just buried his mother. He was still carrying the kind of grief that does not yet have language, the hollow, disoriented weight of a loss so sudden and so public that there had been no space to absorb it privately. And now his father was asking him to sit across from the woman he held responsible for his mother's suffering and make peace with her. So William went. He sat in that room. He kept his face completely still and his emotions completely locked. He gave Camilla nothing, not a smile, not a single crack in the wall he had built around himself. And when it was over, he left. Within days, precise details of that private meeting were published across the British press. Details that could only have come from inside that room. The story, broken first by the news of the world, painted the encounter as warm and reassuring. It described Camilla as gracious and entirely unthreatening, exactly the image her personal spin doctor, Mark Boland, had been hired specifically to construct. The narrative served one purpose: to begin softening public opinion toward the woman Charles intended to marry. William's private grief, his silence, his pain, all of it had been handed to a journalist and repackaged into a flattering story about Camilla while he was still bleeding from losing his mother. According to Harry's memoir, when William discovered what had happened, he fell apart completely. Harry found him and sat with him, everything stripped away, nothing left to hold behind. William looked at his brother and said 2 things. First, "I don't think I like her." Then, with a quietness that made it worse, "We are not going to be safe with her." He was 16 years old, and every word of it turned out to be true. He never forgot what she did with that meeting, and he never fully trusted her again. In 2011, William invited Laura's daughter Eliza to serve as a bridesmaid at his wedding to Catherine. The world interpreted it as peace, a blended family moving forward with grace and generosity. But William had not forgiven. He had simply chosen, for the sake of his father and the functioning of the family around him, to file it away, to keep the surface smooth, to wait. What followed over the next decade, Laura's slow, deliberate advancement through royal events, one unchallenged appearance at a time, was not a separate story. It was the same story continuing. The Parker Bowles family using quiet persistence and proximity to claim what the institution had never formally granted them. Camilla had always understood that the most effective power is the kind that never announces itself. You simply keep moving forward until your presence feels inevitable, until no one remembers a time when you were not there. William had watched it happen in real time. He had said nothing. He had filed every single moment away. But Camilla had made one critical miscalculation. She had assumed that because William stayed silent, he was not keeping count. He was keeping count. And he was also watching something else, something she had done in 2022 that told him exactly how far she was willing to go and exactly what kind of document he would need to stop her. In the weeks before the Royal Maundy service, a coordination meeting was held at Buckingham Palace. On the surface, it was routine, the kind of administrative gathering that takes place before every major royal occasion. Logistics, arrangement, guest lists. When the guest list came up, the representatives from Camilla's office did something that made William's team go very still. They presented Laura's attendance as already decided, not proposed, not requested, not floated as a possibility subject to approval. Already decided. The assumption beneath it was loud and completely unambiguous: Camilla is the queen. Her daughter goes where she goes. There is nothing left to discuss. William's team raised a formal objection. The response from Camilla's side was described by people present in that room as dismissive and contemptuous. They genuinely believed there was no argument to be had. William sat with that for a moment. Then he turned to his team and gave one instruction: put it in writing. What followed was not a simple guest list correction. The document William had drafted was structured as a formal policy revision, a permanent update to the rules governing attendance at royal ceremonial events. From this point forward, every future occasion would be measured against it. Attendance would need to be justified by an actual official role. If you could not point to a specific duty you were there to perform, the answer was no. Laura's name was removed. The door was shut, and the framework that had allowed her name to appear in the first place no longer existed. But here is what makes this document so much darker than it first appears. William did not put it in writing because he was being procedural. He put it in writing because he knew exactly who he was dealing with, and he knew precisely what Camilla's operation was capable of doing with anything left unrecorded. In 2022, when Harry was a teenager, he had privately visited a drug rehabilitation center. That visit had nothing to do with Charles. Charles had not arranged it, had not been involved, had not even known about it in advance. But when the story of Harry's drug use was about to break publicly, something calculated and cold took place inside Camilla's communications operation. The rehabilitation visit was quietly handed to journalists, repackaged entirely as a different story. The version that ran across Britain painted Charles as a responsible, hands-on father who had personally discovered his son's behavior and marched him to face its consequences. It made Charles look decisive and caring. It made Camilla, standing loyally beside him, look like exactly the kind of steady partner Britain should learn to accept. Camilla's own friend Petronella Wyatt later admitted the situation looked like a son being handed to the wolves to improve his father's image. Harry himself said he had been pushed directly under a bus. A teenager's private pain reel, raw, and his alone had been picked up, reframed, and used as a publicity instrument. William knew every detail of what had been done. He was not going to give Camilla another unrecorded conversation she could deny, reframe, or carry to a sympathetic journalist. The letter was permanent. It was irrefutable, and Camilla had no mechanism left to spin it. But she had one argument remaining, one she believed was so logically airtight that even William could not dismantle it. She was wrong, and the moment William took it apart was the moment the entire palace understood that this was no longer a family disagreement. It was a transfer of power. And it had already begun. With the document already filed and her internal network already compromised, Camilla understood that she was running out of ground. So she reached for the one argument she believed William could not logically dismiss. She pointed to James, Earl of Wessex, the 18-year-old son of Prince Edward and Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh. Sophie had been feeling unwell during this period and had been stepping back from a number of royal engagements as a result. James had been quietly stepping in, appearing alongside his father at various events to ensure the family remained represented. He held no working royal role. He carried no official title that came with a formal mandate. And yet there he was, present, visible, standing inside the institution without anyone raising a formal objection. To Camilla, this felt like a decisive argument. If James could appear at royal occasions simply because his mother could not attend, then what exactly was the institutional principle that made Laura any different? She told anyone who would listen that William's decision had nothing to do with protocol. It was, she insisted, personal animosity dressed in the language of procedure, a stepson using bureaucratic machinery to humiliate his stepfamily under the cover of institutional integrity. William's response dismantled the argument completely and without sentiment. James, Earl of Wessex, is a grandson of Queen Elizabeth II. He carries the bloodline of the sovereign house. His presence at any royal occasion is not merely a social arrangement, it is a constitutional statement. It is the living, visible proof that the Windsor line continues and that the institution endures across generations. That presence carries weight that has nothing to do with personal preference and everything to do with what the monarchy fundamentally represents. Laura Lopes carries none of that. She is a member of Camilla's private family, a Parker Bowles, not a Windsor with no bloodline claim, no constitutional standing, and no institutional role of any kind. To treat those two categories as equivalent was not a reasonable comparison. It was the precise institutional confusion that William had spent years identifying and that Camilla had spent years deliberately engineering the slow, patient blurring of lines between the royal family and the consort's private relatives, repeated until the distinction began to feel arbitrary to those inside the palace who had simply grown accustomed to Laura's presence. That confusion ended with the document. Standing in complete alignment with William throughout all of this was Princess Anne, and her support for the exclusion was not qualified or conditional. It was total. Anne completed 474 royal engagements in 2024, more than any other working royal in the institution. She is its most rigorous enforcer of the principle that presence must be earned through duty and nothing else. Her alignment with William was not a mild endorsement passed through back channels. It was a verdict, delivered through the most powerful currency available inside the British monarchy, her own unimpeachable record of service. Camilla's argument had failed. Her network had crumbled. Anne had closed ranks. The private secretaries, the senior advisors, the logistical officials who coordinate the sovereign's calendar, all of them were now operating inside a framework that William had already established. The machinery had begun moving, and it had not paused to ask Camilla's permission. There was only one door left. One person who could still reverse everything with a single word: her husband, the king. And what happened inside that room, what Charles did, and what he did not do, was the moment that defined the rest of everything. There is a particular kind of silence that is worse than any argument. It does not comfort. It does not leave room for negotiation or hope. It simply tells you with complete and devastating finality exactly where you stand and exactly how little ground you have left beneath you. Camilla went to Charles herself, and she did not frame what William had done as a procedural dispute or an administrative overreach. She framed it as a direct personal attack on her dignity, on her loyalty, and on the loyalty of her children, who had spent decades absorbing public hatred without a single word of public retaliation. Tom and Laura had grown up watching their mother called a home wrecker in headlines across the world. They had endured all of it. They had been loyal when loyalty cost them everything. And now her own stepson had formally humiliated her daughter in a document that would sit permanently in the official palace records. She told Charles he needed to exercise his sovereign prerogative and override the order. She told him that a king should not be overruled by his heir inside his own house. Charles said nothing. He did not defend her. He did not reach for the telephone to call William. He did not offer her comfort or resistance or even the smallest gesture that suggested he was still weighing the decision. He withdrew completely, and that silence was the answer. The reason Charles could not move was as cold and precise as the silence itself. Reversing William's written order would publicly humiliate the man currently carrying the entire operational weight of the monarchy while Charles fought cancer. It would signal to every department, every diplomat, and every courtier watching that the heir's formal institutional decrees could be undone by a private marital request. It would hand every critic of the monarchy the most dangerous narrative imaginable that the king was being directed by his wife. Anne and William were in complete alignment. Charles could see that with absolute clarity. And Charles had made catastrophic choices before. He had chosen Camilla over Diana for decades. He had watched his marriage collapse in public humiliation that scarred his sons in ways that never fully healed. He was not going to make a comparable mistake in reverse. The institution always wins. He had learned that at an unbearable personal cost. He would not forget it now. But there is one detail that places Charles's silence in its fullest and most devastating context. On the night of August 31st, 1997, when the call came from Paris confirming that Diana was dead, Charles telephoned Camilla. He told her, and then through his tears he asked her a question. Not how do I tell my sons, not how do I protect William and Harry from this, he asked her. What is going to happen to us now? William was 15 years old that night, asleep at Balmoral, about to be told the worst news of his life, and his father was already on another call, asking a completely different question. That question launched the rehabilitation campaign, the spin operation, the press manipulation, the long march toward the coronation, the construction of everything Camilla now holds. Nearly 3 decades later, Charles sat in silence while his son dismantled the empire that question had built one written order at a time. And Camilla understood something about that silence that made it almost unbearable to face. It was not just a defeat. It was a preview of everything that was coming next. When Charles dies, Camilla becomes Queen Dowager. The title sounds significant. It carries weight in the way that all royal titles carry weight, the language of history, the suggestion of permanence, the faint impression of continued relevance. But strip away the language and what remains is this. Queen Dowager is a title with no power whatsoever, no mandate, no operational authority, no institutional role of any kind. It is, in every practical sense, a ceremonial farewell dressed in dignified clothing. Where she lives after Charles is gone, William decides. Whether she retains her patronages, William decides. Whether she maintains any public presence, any platform, any continued connection to the institution she spent 30 years fighting to enter, William decides. The man who has always merely tolerated her, the man she has always known on some level to be a little afraid of. Sources close to the palace are unambiguous on one point. Camilla has never wanted to relinquish her responsibilities. She has wanted to be queen her entire adult life. And now, while her husband still sat on the throne, still wore the crown, she was watching her future being quietly shaped by someone else's hand. This is why the conflict between William and Camilla had never been only about Laura. It had been running on a second, far more dangerous front for months before that coordination meeting ever took place. And the battlefield on that front was Charles himself. After Charles's cancer diagnosis, William's position was clear and completely non-negotiable. His father needed to rest. He needed to step back from public duties and focus entirely on his recovery. That was the beginning and end of it. Camilla was pushing in the exact opposite direction. She was encouraging Charles to remain visible, to keep attending engagements, keep appearing in public, keep placing himself in front of the cameras. The conflict became so acute that it broke open over one specific occasion, a state banquet held for a visiting head of state. William believed his father was too weakened to attend. Camilla was insisting their presence was not optional. An insider confirmed it directly. Camilla was absolutely adamant they had to be there. And here is what makes that so revealing. Camilla was not pushing Charles to keep working out of devotion. She was doing it out of something far colder. Every day that Charles remained on the throne as an active, visible sovereign was another day the full transfer of power to William was delayed. Another day she kept her title, her platform, and everything she had spent 3 decades constructing. She was not protecting her husband. She was protecting herself. William had watched Camilla operate this way for years. Harry's memoir documented how Charles and Camilla's communications team had deliberately planted damaging stories about both princes and their wives, running a calculated press campaign that generated favorable coverage for Charles and Camilla at the direct expense of their own sons. When William and Harry confronted Charles about it personally, he told them they were being paranoid and refused to hear another word of it. William had tolerated all of it because his father loved her. Because keeping the surface smooth had always seemed, until now, like the more dignified choice. The Maundy exclusion was the moment that tolerance finally reached its end, and the ceremony itself was only days away, the moment when everything William had set in motion would become impossible to ignore, impossible to reverse, and impossible to explain away. The moment the story left the palace corridors, it changed shape entirely. Royal correspondents and commentators who had spent years carefully tracking the guest lists of major ceremonial occasions began to notice what was not there. Editors who had covered every royal appearance Laura Lopes had made over the previous decade, the Garter service, the state funeral, the coronation balcony, the Sandringham Christmas, looked at the congregation inside St. Second, Asaph Cathedral and registered the gap. No announcement had been made. No explanation had been offered. But the people whose profession it was to count faces in royal spaces counted this one, and they understood immediately that something had shifted. Within hours, the conversation had moved beyond the ceremony itself. Royal analysts began framing the exclusion not as an isolated guest list decision, but as a signal, the first clearly visible evidence of a deliberate recalibration of the monarchy's boundaries under William's emerging authority. Commentators who had long observed the gradual creep of Laura's appearances, each one quiet, each one unchallenged, each one slightly deeper than the last, noted that what had happened was not a sudden rupture but the formal end of a pattern that should arguably have been addressed years earlier. The public debate that followed divided along a fault line that no one inside the palace could have fully predicted in advance. On one side, those who argued that William had acted with precisely the kind of institutional clarity that the monarchy requires, that the decade of unchecked access had been an embarrassment to the crown, and that a Prince of Wales, willing to enforce formal boundaries while his father still sat on the throne, was exactly the kind of future King Britain needed. On the other side, those who saw a stepson using the machinery of an ancient institution to deliver a deeply personal punishment, hiding private grievance behind procedural language, and in doing so bringing the internal conflicts of a complicated blended family into the most sacred spaces of the royal calendar. What struck observers most was not the volume of the debate. It was the nature of it. People were not simply arguing about Laura Lopes or about a guest list. They were arguing about what the monarchy is for, about where its boundaries should lie, about whether the institution exists to protect itself or to reflect the family at its center, about whether William was right and whether the people who had stayed silent for a decade while Laura's presence expanded were any less responsible for the situation than Camilla herself. International press picked up the story with an appetite that surprised even seasoned royal watchers. In countries where the British monarchy is followed with genuine attention, the question being asked was pointed and direct. Was this the moment the William era formally began, not at a coronation, not at a funeral, not at any of the grand ceremonial thresholds that history usually assigns to such transitions, but in a quiet written document entered into an administrative system, in the weeks before a service most people had never heard of? The answer, forming in the minds of those watching most closely, was uncomfortable in its simplicity. Yes, this was that moment, and the ceremony itself, the images emerging from inside St. Asaph Cathedral, was about to confirm it in a way that no commentary, no analysis, and no number of column inches could fully capture. Because some things do not need to be said aloud to be completely understood. On the second day of April 2026, the Yeomen of the Guard processed into St. Maine 7. Asaph Cathedral, and the state trumpeters sounded their fanfare across the ancient stone walls. Welsh choirs filled the space with music commissioned specifically for this occasion, an acknowledgement that this was not simply a repetition of tradition, but a moment the nation had chosen to mark with particular care. The cathedral itself, one of the smallest and oldest in Britain, carried the weight of centuries in its walls. Not the grandeur of Westminster Abbey or the commanding scale of St. Originality, Paul's, something quieter. Something that asked the people inside it to set aside the trappings of power and remember what the ceremony was built to honor: humility, service, the complete and unconditional rejection of privilege. King Charles and Queen Camilla arrived together. They moved through the space with the practiced composure that decades of public life produce, every step measured, every gesture considered, every expression calibrated for the cameras that followed them. To the casual observer, they presented the image they always present in public: unity, continuity. The crown in full function, but the cameras, as they always do, recorded more than was intended. Camilla's posture told a story that her face was not permitted to tell. There was a precision to her stillness, the particular quality of composure that only becomes visible when composure is the hardest thing to maintain. She had spent a lifetime performing equanimity under pressure. She was performing it now, and for those watching closely enough, the performance was audible in its effort. Charles moved through the congregation toward the recipients waiting in their rows. 77 men and 77 women, people chosen not for their titles or their connections or their proximity to power, but for decades of quiet, selfless service to their communities. People who had given without expectation of recognition and had, in most cases, never stood inside a room like this in their lives. Charles placed the Maundy coins into each pair of hands personally. The exchange was unhurried, deliberate. One sovereign, one citizen. One moment of genuine contact repeated 77 times across one of the oldest ceremonies in the British calendar. The foundation of this ceremony has always been a single, radical idea that the most powerful figure in the land should kneel, in effect, before the ordinary. That service flows downward from the crown to the people, not upward from the people to those who orbit the crown. Think about what it would have meant to place Laura Lopes inside that. A woman with no title, no working role, no duty to perform, and no institutional reason to be present, standing at the center of a ceremony built entirely on the principle that presence must be earned through sacrifice, not inherited through proximity. The contradiction would not have required explanation. It would simply have existed, visible to anyone who understood what the ceremony was for. She was not there. Her absence required no announcement and no commentary. It was simply a fact, written into the record of the day the way all true institutional facts are written, not in press releases or public statements, but in what actually happened, and what did not. The ceremony concluded, as it has concluded for over 800 years, with dignity, with music, with the crown in full humility before the people it serves, and somewhere in the silence that followed, the most consequential power shift in a generation had already taken place, not on the steps of a cathedral, but on a page, in a document, in the weeks before anyone arrived. There is a calculation Camilla made before Diana ever walked down the aisle. According to her former brother-in-law, Richard Parker Bowles, Camilla initially encouraged Charles's relationship with Diana because she believed Diana was, in his exact words, gormless, passive enough to occupy the marriage, while Camilla remained Charles's true confidant behind it. She never intended to step aside permanently. She simply never believed Diana would become a serious threat. That calculation failed so completely and so catastrophically that its consequences are still unfolding today. Diana was not passive. She was brilliant and magnetic, and so deeply loved that when she died, the largest floral tribute ever recorded in history was left outside the palaces of London. She had confronted Camilla directly face to face at a private gathering in the 1980s, telling her that she knew exactly what was happening between her and Charles. Camilla did not end it. She simply continued, with the same quiet persistence she had always used, confident that patience would outlast everything. And now, decades after she decided Diana was too easy to manage to be a genuine threat, the son of the woman she underestimated is dismantling everything she built, one written order at a time. What William's document permanently changed is not limited to one ceremony or one guest list. It is structural. Every future appearance by any member of Camilla's private family will now be measured against that written policy. The framework that allowed Laura's name to appear unchallenged for nearly a decade no longer exists. The rules are recorded. They are irrefutable. And they will still be sitting in those official palace records on the day William is king. Consider what Camilla has lost. Laura's decade of quiet advancement, the garter service, the state funeral, the coronation balcony, the Sandringham Christmas, all of it is over. The soft power network she spent years constructing inside the palace has been exposed and bypassed. Her greatest weapon, the things that never made it onto paper, the verbal arrangements, the assumed permissions, the silent understandings, has been taken from her by someone who knew precisely how that weapon worked and wrote a document specifically designed to make it obsolete. And consider what the monarchy protected. A ceremony that has run without interruption for over 800 years, the principle that standing inside the institution must be earned through duty and nothing else. The idea that the crown is not a social privilege to be distributed among the families of those who marry into it, but a responsibility carried only by those formally called to carry it. William did not shout. He did not perform. He did not give a single interview or release a single public statement. He simply reached for a pen, wrote a document, and allowed the institution to do what institutions do when someone finally gives them the clarity they require. He is no longer waiting to be king. He is already acting like one. And Camilla now faces the question she cannot spin, cannot reframe, and cannot hand to any sympathetic journalist still willing to take her call. If William will do this to her daughter while his father still wears the crown, while Charles still breathes, still sits on the throne, still holds every formal authority the sovereignty provides, what will he do to her the moment he finally wears it himself? Camilla got the crown she spent 30 years fighting to wear, but it is already being lifted from her hands, not with anger, not with scandal, not with a single word spoken in public, but with the quiet, permanent authority of a man who learned everything he knows about survival from watching what happened to his mother.